Hello, and welcome back. In the next few videos, we'll be applying what we've learned so far to build out the section displayed on your screen. If you haven't done so already, please click on the link provided with this lesson and open the drive. This drive contains all the images we will use for this exercise, as well as the brief itself. Go ahead and download the brief. Once downloaded, feel free to minimize your browser for a moment and pull up the brief. Before we even start building, I'm going to show you a beginner's technique that will help you get a better sense of how we should be designing sites using the editor. As you become more proficient in the editor, you'll gradually use this technique less and less. Consider the following exercise as using training wheels on a bicycle. As you get better at riding the bike, you will at some point become comfortable enough where you will not need these training wheels. Our training wheels will be marking up the brief to help us better visualize how we should be dividing up the space in the editor, which will inform how we end up designing our site. How might you want to tackle this project? Think about what elements, containers, and even properties we might consider using to build this section. Please take a second to pause the video to think about this. I'll give you a rather big hint. We are going to be using columns to build this out. As a quick reminder, columns leverage a technology called CSS Flexbox. Can you remember what this technology does? If you said or thought something along the lines of, "It allows us to create beautiful and responsive websites that adapt to any screen size," then well done. But what we should really be asking ourselves is how? How does CSS Flexbox allow me to build beautiful and responsive websites that adapt to any screen size? The key thing to consider is that CSS Flexbox, which powers our columns and inner columns, gives us control over the direction in which the elements inside those columns are displayed. That is, either horizontally, left to right, or vertically, top to bottom. To jog your memory, I've pulled up these familiar shapes to illustrate how our columns work. This is what we mean when we say that Flexbox only allows us to work in one direction. It essentially means that you can only set the layout of all your elements, in our case, the different colored shapes, that have been placed inside our container to either appear from left to right, as shown on the screen, or top to bottom. Remember, you can only set one or the other. You might be thinking now, well, this is a bit limiting. How can we have elements going in both directions? To add this level of complexity, we will need to nest other layout elements inside our columns. This could either be using a horizontal inner column or a vertical inner column, and even an advanced grid, which we have yet to explore but will get to in a later lesson. Let's see what inner columns allow us to do. I can add an inner column anywhere inside my existing column and then change its direction once added. From here, any element that gets added to this inner column will be positioned according to that inner column's stacking direction. When you start adding inner columns within a column or even another inner column, this is called nesting. And really, nesting is what allows us to introduce complexity and have elements laid out both horizontally and vertically. Let's go back to our brief and start marking it up. I'm going to be using a built-in image editing tool for this exercise, but if you have anything fancier, feel free to use that. The very first step is to identify all of the containers that you're going to be working with. At a first glance, how many containers do you see that we're going to need? So just at first glance, I see that we're going to use at least 4 different containers. I'll draw a box around the first container I see, and actually I'm going to create blocks instead to better visualize this. So there's one right here. Let's do the same for all the others. This gives us a better sense of what we are building and how the section in the editor will be divided up. So now, let's head on over to the editor and add the 4 containers we drew. On the screen, you'll see a blank site. If you have a test site, feel free to add a new section there. Otherwise, please create a new site using Editor 2.0. You'll notice that any template you choose will already come with a couple of sections built in by default. I'm going to hide any unnecessary elements, such as the header and footer, to keep this exercise clear. Let's refer back to our brief. I want to start off by saying that there are many ways to design this brief. The way I will show you is just one of many. As you become more advanced, feel free to experiment with the different ways you can build out your designs. Let's get started. The big block on the left could take up an entire column in the editor, so I'm going to leave this left column here untouched. The area to the right, however, is where I might want to nest a couple of layout elements. Why? You'll notice that we have one container at the top and two containers below side by side. Remember, CSS Flexbox only allows us to stack elements either top to bottom or left to right. But in this case, we have one container stacked at the top and then two smaller containers stacked below, being placed from left to right. Checkpoint question: how do we get elements to stack in two directions instead of just one? Think about this for a minute. If you're having a difficult time answering this, then you may want to consider rewinding a couple of minutes or so back. Let's quickly review what we have on the screen. We have 4 orange blocks, each representing an individual container in the editor. And just a quick reminder, a container refers to any section, column, or layout element, like an inner column. We've already determined that the large block on the left will be constructed using the left column in the editor. But to construct the 3 containers on the right, we'll need to do a bit of nesting. I'm now going to wrap the 4 containers you see on the screen with a couple more boxes. These 2 new blue boxes represent the 2 main columns that we see in the editor. Looking at the blue container on the right, how many containers will be added inside in total? The answer is 4. Why? Let's count. We need at least 1 big container at the top and 2 smaller containers right below, which brings our count to only 3 containers. Where's the 4th one? Earlier we talked about how in order to create a 2-dimensional layout with elements stacked both horizontally and vertically, such as required by this column, we'd have to nest inner columns. So we'll need to add 1 more inner column to achieve our desired layout, bringing our container count from 3 to 4. Let's revisit this concept by looking at the inner column we added earlier with shapes 1 and 2 inside. This should hopefully clear up any confusion. We see that the inner column we added earlier is set to stack horizontally, which explains why shapes 1 and 2 are positioned side by side. From the Layers panel, when I collapse this inner column, I'm able to see how the inner column fits in with the other elements in the hierarchy a bit more clearly. At the grandparent level, we have a section. Inside the section, we have our parent column. And within the parent column, we have all its children elements, which consist of shapes and our horizontal inner column. Here's the key takeaway. When you need to position elements in both directions, vertically, like shapes 3 through 9, and horizontally, like shapes 1 and 2, you'll want to nest in inner columns. Let's head on back to the brief. How should we build this out? If we open the design panel for this column, you'll see that the stacking direction has already been set to vertical. Based on how our 3 containers have been laid out, should the main column's stacking direction be set to horizontal or vertical? The answer is vertical. Let's illustrate this concept. I'll draw an arrow to indicate the direction of the column. When I set the column's stacking direction to vertical, then that means that our 2 smaller containers will also get stacked vertically. To avoid this, we need to nest these 2 small containers inside an inner column, and its stacking direction will be set to horizontal. Remember, when you set a stacking direction of a column or inner column, it's the content inside that container that gets arranged according to the specified direction. So in this case, because this inner column's stacking direction has been set to horizontal, its children, which are the 2 small orange containers, will be set side by side. But the inner column itself is actually the second child element of our main column, and it's being stacked vertically. If I've confused you a bit, let's dive into the editor and start building. That should help clear things up. I'm going to start by replicating the same steps as we just did and actually draw 4 orange containers in the editor. First, I'll start by changing the background color of this column to orange. Over on the right, let's add the top block first. We will use layout elements as our blocks, and the only type of layout element we'll be using in this example will be an inner column. You'll notice that we technically have 2 layout elements called inner columns, but really, It's just one inner column with a stacking direction preset. By the way, if you ever choose the wrong type of inner column, you can always change its stacking direction once added. I'll fix its height in just a moment. Let me add the other two small blocks first. I'm going to adjust this new inner column's width to 50% and set its color to orange. I might need to update the size later, but let's leave it as is for now. For the second small box, I could duplicate the last one we just made. But because I like to make it more difficult on myself, I will quickly rebuild it. Right now, the layout in the editor doesn't match the layout in our brief. We're trying to get the two smaller boxes to sit right next to each other, but as you can see, it's not as straightforward as just dragging it over. Remember, columns only let us place elements in one direction, either vertically, which is how it is now, or horizontally. Notice that when I switch the main column's direction to horizontal, all three blocks line up side by side. So we got our two small containers to sit right next to each other like we wanted. But we've also ended up with the big container on the same level as well, which we don't want. Let's change the main column's stacking direction back to vertical. To match the brief's layout, I'll need to nest an inner column within our main column. Unlike the main column, this inner column's stacking direction will be set to horizontal. This will allow us to place the two small boxes one next to the other. And I'm going to give it a red border to help us visualize this concept a bit more easily. Now I'm going to add the two small containers to this inner column. Great. We are getting closer to the desired layout. Let's revisit the size of our two smaller containers. In the brief, you'll notice a small gap between them. To add this gap, I could play around with their margin or padding settings, but the better option would be to adjust our container's size settings instead. If you recall, we had specified that each container be set to 50%. So if we set two elements to be 50% each, they'll fill up the entire space, 100% of it. This means there won't be any extra room left for the gap we see in the brief. So to create that space, let's maybe change both of their widths to 49%. Let's do a quick calculation. If each of these small containers is set to 49% width, they'll use up 98% of the space in the parent column, which is shown by the red border. And that leaves us with a 2% gap. But this 2% gap is all the way at the end, and looking at our brief, the space should be placed in between the two containers. Let's take a look at the inner column's horizontal content alignment setting under Layout. Notice that our two small containers, which even match the icon, are aligned to the left. So what this does is pushes that 2% space to the end of the inner column. But we can choose the space between option, and that will push our two containers to either end of the container and place whatever available space there is between them. Next, I'm going to add a blue border to my two main columns just to maintain consistency with what we outlined in the brief earlier. Let's add the finishing touches to our containers, like adjusting their size and fixing any remaining gaps or spacing issues. I'm going to begin by making our two main columns, the ones in blue, a bit smaller. As you might recall from a previous lesson, columns can inherit their height from sections, and in this case, this section's height has been set to almost 900 pixels. I'm going to bring it down to about 600 pixels and may adjust later. Next, I'm going to set this top container to 300 pixels. And lastly, I'm going to try to resize the two small containers below, wrapped inside the inner column in red. Notice that if I increase the height of the parent container, the one in red, the two child containers inside don't adjust to its parent's resizing. That's because each container has been given a fixed pixel height of 160 pixels. To make their heights dynamic, meaning they respond to the resizing of their parent container, let's select the Stretch option under the Alignment property for each container. Now, as I resize that parent inner column in red, the two children containers adjust accordingly. Let's then get rid of the white space around the inner edge of the column that looks like padding. If we click into the main column, you'll find a 16 pixel padding value set all around. Click Reset Padding to set all padding values back to 0. But you'll see that there's still a little bit of space at the top and bottom inside our main column. My first thought is to check the child elements of the main column, so the top container and the inner column outlined in red below to see if they might have a margin that would be causing that extra space, but that's not the case here. So then the next place I would check is the section's height. And why check the section's height? Remember, columns can inherit their height from their parent sections, so there is a chance that the white space we're seeing might be a result of the parent column's size. To test my theory, I'm going to shrink the section's height to 500 pixels. If that makes the extra top and bottom space disappear, it'll prove that the white space we were seeing was actually due to the column's height. And as you can see, that extra space did indeed disappear. And just a quick note, you can also readjust the size of any section by dragging it up and down. A little tooltip will appear on the screen telling you what the section's height will be once you let go. Next, I'm going to bring our two inner columns here a bit closer. If you look at the brief, it looks like this space here is about twice as big as it needs to be, so let's make that smaller. A property that is unique to columns is this spacing between elements property, which controls how much space is between or amongst the elements in your main column. So let's just cut that space in half from 24 to 12 pixels. And now you'll see 12 pixels of blank space get created at the bottom of the column, which I'm just going to remove by resizing my section's height. And that's a wrap on preparing the containers we'll need for our design. In the next video, we'll finish up our design by putting into practice some of the same ideas we've been using. But before you move on to the next video, why not give it a shot and try building out this section yourself? In our previous video, we built out the structure of the section to design our brief. And as you may remember, we have a link to a drive full of images we will be using. Let's go ahead and upload these images by navigating to Content, then to the Media Manager. From here, I will select the Import Images option, then Social Media. I'm then going to access my Google Drive to upload our files. Now that the images are uploaded, I'm going to go back to the brief we had initially marked up and remove some of these markings we made earlier that were meant to represent what containers we were going to use. Let's start with the left side of the brief. I'll start off by removing the blue border and the orange color, replacing it with one of our newly uploaded images. Next, I will add a text widget and I'll quickly type in the copy. And really quickly, I'll update our font color from the theme panel and let me make any final minor adjustments. You'll notice that text box we added appears to be placed in the middle of our column. Why is that? According to our design, we need the text at the top of the column, but we can't simply move this text widget up. Columns do not work that way. This is due to the column's properties in the layout section. You'll notice that our text has been justified to the left side because the horizontal content alignment property is set to left. The text is centered because the vertical alignment is set to middle. This means that not just this text widget, but all widgets we add to this column will be positioned to the middle of the column. Let me add the button to better illustrate this, and I'm going to speed this video up and skip through the design of the button. Okay, let's go back to the inner column. As you might recall, the vertical content alignment property is set to middle. This means that all widgets added will be centered vertically within the column. But our brief requires that we have one element pushed to the bottom and the other to the top. Remember, unlike the classic editor where you align elements one by one, Editor 2.0 lets you align all elements within a container at once. To do this, we need to visit the inner column's content alignment properties. Choosing the top alignment option will push both elements to the top, which isn't what we want. To achieve this, I need to take all of that available space and put it in between the two elements. So I'll use the space between option. And lastly, let me give this column a corner radius of 20 pixels. That looks good. Let's move on to the next section. I'll begin by removing the blue solid line that was meant to represent my main column. Now I'm going to focus on this top container where I'll set the background color to transparent and use one of the images we uploaded. But hold up, why not hit pause and try building this small section out on your own? You'll notice that the layout of this container is very similar to the item we built on the left, but with an added layer of complexity due to the third item in the middle. Remember our earlier discussion about columns? They follow a single direction, either stacking elements from top to bottom or left to right. In this case, we have a container where items are stacked top to bottom, but we also have a group of 3 items stacked horizontally from left to right. I will now build this out, and you'll notice that it's similar to the container we just built on the left. Let's add the text widget, justify it to the left, and adjust the text by making it bold. I'm going to skip the 3 images in the middle for now and add the bottom button. You'll notice that this time, our 2 elements are placed at the top. Can you investigate and find out why? Let's examine the content alignment properties from the container these elements are being placed in. Remember, the elements are stacked vertically because the stacking direction is set to vertical. And why are they in the center and not being justified to the left like our previous container? That's because the horizontal content alignment property has been set to center. And lastly, why are my 2 elements being placed at the top? That is due to the vertical content alignment property being set to top. So all existing and new elements will get added to the top. So if we want these 2 items to be at the top and bottom respectively with space in between, what do we need to do? Similar to the container on the left, we need to choose the space between option. And to align both of them to the left, we need to change the horizontal content alignment to the left. You'll notice that there's no space around the inside of the column, unlike the previous container we had built. This is because this container has a 16 pixel padding all around, while the other does not. To maintain the same amount of padding, we can quickly update that. And lastly, let me just make this text box a bit larger to get rid of that 3rd line. Now, we'll add our 3 images using a simple shape widget, and I'll choose a circle and adjust the size to 50 pixels. That might be too big, so let's adjust it to 40 pixels. From here, I'll duplicate my shape and quickly add their corresponding images to each. Let me move the floating bar out of the way. Okay, notice that these 3 shapes we added are stacking vertically. This is because the stacking direction of this inner column is set to vertical. As a result, it's impossible to simply place this image next to the one on top. If I need elements going both vertically and horizontally, I'll need to use an inner column inside this container. Since the direction of this inner column is set to horizontal, any element placed inside of it will be arranged horizontally. Once I drag my elements here, they are set to horizontal. You can always switch this up if you like. If you later decide to stack them vertically, you can adjust this in the container and play around with the alignment properties to get the look and feel you want. But for this case, we need to reset the stacking direction to horizontal and set the vertical content alignment to the middle. This will place the elements as shown. We'll keep the horizontal alignment property to the left, so all elements are on the left-hand side. And notice that when I shrink down the size of this inner column, the 3 shapes inside don't scale down. Can you recall why that is? That's because we had set each shape to 40 pixels width. So because it has been given an absolute unit and not relative, my shapes will not resize to the resizing of the parent inner column. Lastly, I'll add a 20 pixel radius to the inner column's border to get that nice, smooth look. Now let's quickly build these 2 small containers out. I'm going to start by building the one on the left first, changing the background color to brown. By now you should notice how this container is similar to the others we've worked on, like what direction it should stack in and how to align the content. Let's quickly add our 2 text widgets and their copy. Lastly, we'll change our content alignment setting to space between. And for the final touches, let's add a 16 pixel padding all around the container. And I'm just realizing that we may have chosen the wrong font, but that's okay. You can change it to match the one on the brief. And let's add our 20 pixel border. Okay, and we're finished with this container. Now I could rebuild the last container from scratch, but what's neat about Editor 2.0 is that I can select the current container and just duplicate it. And let me just make the necessary changes. Voila! We've built our first section in using columns and inner columns in Editor 2.0. The focus of this video was to get familiar with how columns work and not to optimize this design for tablet or mobile. But as you can see, you can easily navigate to the other 2 breakpoints and play around with their layout independently. For instance, on mobile, some elements may seem a little crowded, like our 2 smaller containers, and one of the great features of Editor 2.0 is the ability to customize your site per breakpoint. For example, here I can select the inner column that houses the two containers and switch its stacking direction to vertical. That way each block takes up the entire width of the viewport. You could also add a bit of spacing between these two items by decreasing their sizes, as we did earlier. What's more, you can make these customizations per breakpoint, so the edits we made on mobile will leave the tablet and desktop versions untouched.